Good day and welcome to this Focus on Special with me, Dewald Rademeyer. Funding of green projects and infrastructure is quintessential for its success. James Agin, Managing Principal of Corporate and Investment Banking for Absa in Kenya, joins me now to delve deeper into the financing models for renewable energy. James, welcome. While we are talking about the funding infrastructure, I want to get a sense from you, what is the role of financiers in green energy projects?
Well, thank you very, very much, Dewald. And indeed, you bring a very important question, given that, of course, the global climate change environment has really thrust, renewable energy into the global spotlight. And the role of our financial institutions is to act as a catalyst, working together with the government and private sector developers to make this dream a reality. So as financial sector players, our role is just to ensure that we leverage on our financial power, our extensive networks that we have, and our ability to drive systemic change to ensure that we actually catalyze and accelerate the pace and scale of this critical transition.
Now, James, walk us through the different funding models that you get for projects like your green energy projects, and also subsequently the infrastructure that's needed. Because I can't imagine it's just put up a solar farm and hope for the best.
Yes, and in terms of process, we play multiple roles in the process. So one is we do an advisory role in ensuring that the due diligence and commercial viability of the project which our partner wants to do is in place. So we work together with the developers through that early stage process of doing the due diligence to just ensure that the sources of renewable energy that need to be used are actually viable and long-term in nature to be able to come in place. We then, of course, make sure that the infrastructure and the hardware, for lack of better word, developers who bring in the equipment which will be used in generation are the right type of suppliers. They are fit for purpose, will be there for the long term as part of the due diligence process. And on the back of that, then make sure that that element too is actually well covered. And of course, working together with the partner to ensure that from an advisory perspective, we are bringing in the right type of technology which is relevant for the development that needs to happen. We then work very, very closely with the partner in terms of the financial model that will be put in place, and together with risk mitigation structures, the right project finance, given that in many instances, these are long-term projects which require proper risk mitigation structures to make them viable, also for investors who would want to come in and development finance partners, to just ensure that all that then is tied up in a manner that then makes the project viable. We also make sure that from a regulatory compliance perspective, the due diligence around that is actually ticks through, because that also becomes very important in ensuring that the project from an end-to-end perspective is viable. Thank you.
Talking about investors, what are the associated risks for investors? Is it based on the fact that technology is changing frequently?
Yes, Dewald. There are mainly two risks when it comes for the investors. One is first that because of the ever-changing technology, you have to ensure that the technology you're going to deploy will remain favorable and will be there for the long term and relevant and can be adopted if necessary to the changing environments that come into place. I think what's also very important for investors, and specifically when you're looking at natural sources of energy, it could be solar, it could be steam for geothermal power, is ensuring that the reserves that are available, especially come to geothermal, they are sufficient to run through the period of the investment that you actually have. Because the last thing you want is to find that the sources of energy or the reserves that you're going to deploy are not sufficient and run out midstream through the life of the project, as it were. What's also really, really important, of course, is the regulatory environment to ensure that the cash flows that will arise out of the project for the long term are actually certain, and you can then model it into your business projections for the viability, long-term viability of the project. And on the back of that, for us, then those are the key risks that we see in this kind of projects, and the role we as Absa CIB have in ensuring that these risks are ably mitigated before the project actually takes off.
Are you slowly steering yourself away from your more traditional, your more fossil fuel-like energy projects?
Yes, Dewald, you are very right from that perspective, in that we are very, very focused as an institution on the ESG agenda and being a force for good in society. And therefore, the role that we need to play, especially on the emerging challenges on climate change and ensuring that our ESG role in terms of a power production perspective is leaning towards the environmental friendly sources, we are very, very intentional around our desire to support new energy and green energy that supports the environmental well good, and therefore on that basis focusing towards the green energy side of business from our energy perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, James. Thanks for coming in and unpacking this for us today. That is James Agin, Managing Principal of Corporate and Investment Banking for Absa Bank in Kenya. Thank you for sharing your insights on the financing models for different renewable energy. As governments, regulators, finance institutions, and power developers gather to tackle Africa's energy industry at this year's Africa Energy Forum, one does have to wonder what Africa's progress is thus far in developing or generating cleaner energy to help reduce carbon emission while keeping up with global demand to mine for green minerals. Shirley Weber, Coverage Head of Resources and Energy at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, joins me now from Kenya to bring more light on this. To start on that note, I think essentially what I want to know is, what challenges do we have when it comes to transmission and distribution of the energy network?
Thanks, Dewald. I think everyone is working towards the energy transition. And although generation is actually happening, especially in South Africa, and it's flowing over to many of our African countries, there is an issue on the actual transmission, as well as the distribution of that generated power. So what should be happening really is, apart from governments getting involved, there needs to be private involvement as well. So as we've seen, private involvement in generation, the same process should actually happen with the distribution as well as the transmission, in order to make sure that the grid is fully functional.
But surely, dollar for dollar, every country is competing to get that foreign investment. But with South Africa particularly going through this load shedding challenge, how do we get that foreign investment through this problem?
There's definitely competition in the African countries, for investments coming into the various countries. So what should happen is South Africa must make sure that there's a stability, in the political framework. There should be monetary and fiscal clarity. There should be no leeway for any doubt in what investors will actually get, for example, out of it. And the competition is tough. Egypt, we've seen, for example, the Middle East investing heavily into Egypt as well. We've seen many investors coming through to South Africa as well, but the quantums are obviously very different.
Egypt is dominating the renewable energy market. So essentially what I want to know is, what can the different countries in Africa do to learn from each other?
Yes, Dewald, I think there's a few lessons to be learned. In South Africa, we've seen the IPP office putting a very successful program in place, with the rounds 1 to 6, with gas to power also being planned, with the battery storage, for example, happening as well. Clearly with a government support as well. In Egypt specifically, they're very similar than our situation, because there's also the Eskom equivalent on that side. And they are working towards putting, for example, 18 gigawatts in place, around about 2032, whilst South Africa is planning in the region of about 30, since we've announced the integrated resource plan from 2019. The learning should be, all stakeholders should be working together, the government, the IPPs, investors into that, the financial services industry. There's a lot that can be done, and I think the willingness is there.
How do all the countries work together to help advance Africa's energy?
We've noticed that because we look after the mining operations as well, that many of the inputs, for example, let's use Tanzania, with their graphite resources that they're sitting with, that, for example, will go over to China to be obviously processed, and then clearly it will come back, for batteries and battery storage, etc. I think what Africa, with its abundant resources, should be doing is definitely more on the manufacturing and the processing of the minerals and metals that is sitting in the various countries. In other words, where job creation can actually happen, where growth for the countries can happen, and clearly with the resources, there's enough to be exported as well, but maybe in a different form. And we've seen many African countries wanting local content happening, as well as creating, employment.
Do Africa have enough resources to sustain this demand in the long-term future?
I don't think we would have in infinity, resources, but each and every country, if I look at Zambia, copper, Tanzania, graphite. If you look at DRC, they're sitting with 75% of the world's cobalt, for example. I think Africa has got enough diversity in these various commodities that we should actually all working together to make sure that we bring a balanced and a phased-in approach to the just transition. We can't necessarily cut off everything, that Africa is sitting with. So that balanced phased approach is important. And we've seen the amount of gas that's sitting on the African continent, or in the waters close to the African continent. Gas to power is definitely going to play that intermediary role until we all move to be completely green.
Shirley, we did run out of time at this point, so I do want to thank you. That was Shirley Weber, Coverage Head of Resources and Energy at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking. Thank you for joining us all the way from Kenya, and that's it for today. Until next time, goodbye.